The police had known about this little girl sleeping in the park for about a week. They wanted to help her, but she firmly rejected them every time. But enough was enough, and they decided to follow her to figure out what was happening. And what they discovered about this poor little girl shocked the officers to their core. The officers weren't really sure what they were supposed to do now. They had followed the supposedly homeless girl after she had left the park this morning like they were tasked to do, but they never expected her to leave them here. It would not be long after this until they discovered why the girl decided to sleep alone at the park every night. It made a lot of sense, but it was still something the officers had trouble accepting. They wanted to help her, but they knew they couldn't. The officers had to accept the girl's decision, but what they didn't have to accept was the situation that had brought her to make this decision. But why was the girl sleeping in the park every night? Where did she lead the officers, and what could they do about the situation? The first night people saw her sleeping in the park bench, they'd already called the police. Homeless people weren't uncommon here and mostly ignored by them, but seeing a little girl seemingly broke many people's hearts. As you might expect, the police sent an officer to talk to the little girl and see if he could help her. Maybe bring her to her parents or to a homeless shelter, but the little girl wanted nothing to do with him and rejected all their advances very firmly. The police couldn't force somebody to get help, so they had to let the little girl be, but they were not happy about it. And it was also not like they could forget about the little girl, as people started calling about her every night and morning. She was clearly sleeping at the park every night from that first confrontation onwards. A very concerning situation, to say the least, because you never know who could see this girl as an easy target. There were some very bad people combing the city at night, but there was also something strange that the police had started to notice over the past week. Concerned calls about the little girl only came in the late evening, night, and early morning, but during the day nobody seemed to have anything to report about her. Maybe people saw less danger when the homeless girl was awake, but with so many more people in the park at the time, you would expect to get at least a couple of calls about her. Was she maybe doing something else at the time? It was clear that something was going on. They felt a mix of curiosity and concern. It was true that it was indeed a mystery to solve, but more than that, they feared that the young girl's life might be in danger. They knew that they would have to come up with a solution. Two rookie officers were assigned, and their instructions were simple. They were to watch over the young girl while she slept and follow her discreetly when she woke up. It seemed like an easy enough task, and the officers were sent on their way once the first phone call of the night came through. The officers got to the park a while later. The girl had set up her blanket and teddy bear and was fast asleep on the bench, so it was no surprise when the calls came rushing in. It happened every night after all, but for the first time they could report that they were investigating the matter. The officers parked their vehicles on the other end of the street. They did their best to remain quiet and took shifts watching the young girl as she slept. Her safety was a priority, and it wouldn't help to alert her or anyone else of their presence. Tomorrow, however, would be another story. Thankfully, the night was uneventful. Besides a few worried strangers, no one seemed to interact with the young girl. Instead, someone tapped her to ask if she needed help, and others would do a quick breath check or dial the department to report a homeless child, but as luck would have it, that was it. No one did anything more to her, and they were thankful for that, as it wasn't the safest part of the town to be at night. In the end, the girl's response remained the same. She refused any help and simply went back to sleep. A few people, however. The rookie cops did notice that a few people barely acknowledged a sleeping chum. Most of them were dog owners who likely came across her every night. The locals knew that the girl rejected help from strangers, but this only raised more questions. If the girl was really only sleeping at night, why here? Before they knew what morning had arrived, the officers were tired, but it was great practice for stakeouts. They also knew that this was the most critical time, as they would need to be alert to properly investigate what happened to the mysterious girl during the day. Now all she needed to do was wake up. A short while later, the two officers watched as the young girl got up. The sun wasn't out yet and the morning crowd wasn't due for a few more minutes. However, the girl was fast at work. She grabbed her things and placed them gently into a bag. It was clear to the officers she had a routine. They watched her leave the bench and dart towards the park exit. The little girl moved quickly while the officers followed her at a close distance. They wanted to quicken their pace, but they knew they couldn't risk getting caught by her, as she might change her morning plans. Once the park was at a distance, the little girl didn't seem as focused on her destination. At first, they worried that she'd somehow spotted her tail, but it was soon apparent that she was simply taking her time as she made her way through the city's busy streets. But she did something alarming. The officers expected her to stay around the crowds in the busy street, but instead, she was headed in the opposite direction, towards the abandoned part of town. It was the oldest part of the town and it lost most of its residents during city redevelopment. So just what could she be doing there? The cops were now truly confused and very worried. If the girl was indeed homeless, she wasn't going about it the wrong way. She didn't seem interested in sitting by the crowds, but instead she paced onwards, not really paying attention to the people on the street or the other homeless people that sat with signs. The young girl walked for a while longer, but just when they slowed their pace, she took a hard left between the houses. The cops watched in surprise when she stopped in front of a house and knocked, but even more surprising was watching the door open as she walked in seconds later. The house was old and worn down, but it didn't seem like it would collapse anytime soon. So if there were people inside who clearly knew and welcomed her in, why was the young girl sleeping at the park every night? And just what were the people inside up to? The officers watched it happen from a safe distance. Once the door shut, they followed closely behind. Reaching the front door, they knocked and announced their presence. But to their surprise, they were greeted by silence and no one moved to open the door. What was going on? The officers were puzzled by the turn of events. They knew the house was occupied, at the very least a little girl and whoever had opened the door for her moments before were there, but there was no answer. After a few moments of waiting, one of the officers noticed the curtains ruffle on one side. Someone was indeed watching. The officer who had noticed the curtains signaled to her partner, who nodded his understanding. They knocked once more, this time louder, and insisted they were responding to an emergency call. They requested to view the home and ascertain that it was compliant with safety codes, but the response they received was surprising. It was true it was simply a ploy to get to the child or whomever was with her to open the door, but to their surprise, the response they received put a halt to their schemes. A frail but confident voice echoed from the other side of the door, "Do you have a warrant, officer?" The officer's friend, they of course did not have a warrant in their possession. No judge would issue one with so little evidence either. They were stuck. But now they knew one thing for sure: whoever was involved with the little child was old or knowledgeable enough to request a warrant. Although the situation only seemed to get more complicated, the officers felt stumped. They could tell something suspicious at the very least was going on. There was little way of proving to a judge that it was worth it. They would need to come up with a plan in the meanwhile. One of the officers had an idea. Coughing, she spoke. "Guess we'll have to go pick up that warrant after all. Should be about an hour, right?" The officer smiled and nodded before yelling out his agreement. Then both officers walked towards their car that sped off. But they weren't headed towards the station. Instead, they parked a block away and sat in the vehicle. They were back on stakeout duty. It was true they had little chance of getting a warrant, but whoever was behind the door didn't know that. giving them a perfect opportunity to observe the house and possibly gain the probable cause they needed for the warrant. Once more, the officers took shifts as they observed the situation. But like the night before, nothing happened, at least not anything that would justify a warrant. There were little noises heard from the house, but it was impossible to tell what was truly happening with the curtains drawn together in the dimly lit house. The officers began to fear that their suspicions had been just that. Had they wasted a day observing an unofficial shelter, just as they debated returning to the station to report their findings, things suddenly took a surprising turn. The front door opened, and this time it wasn't just a little girl who came out. The officers couldn't believe their eyes. Multiple kids came out of the house. They were all dressed in worn-out and drabby clothes. Some of them had no shoes, but they all had one thing in common: they carried brand-new nondescript backpacks. This was certainly something to work with. The officers were stopped in shock. Now there was no doubt something shady was going on. They debated following the little girl who they noticed was part of the kids wearing the backpacks. After all, she was their initial assignment. But they were quickly interrupted by the appearance of a new set of children. Now this is getting interesting. Like the children who stepped out of the house, this pair of kids were dressed just as shabby with the same nondescript backpacks being carried. But they observed that one thing separated the two groups. These backpacks seemed a lot lighter. What was being carried? One of the officers quickly pulled out a cell phone and started recording the scene in front of them. There was no doubt that this was suspicious enough to create probable cause. The right DA was sure to get them the coveted warrant in no time, but something else needed to be done. The officers agreed to split up. They would cover more ground this way. One of them would stay and wait for the warrant, while the other would follow the girl to see if she was once more heading to the park, or if something more troubling was going on as they suspected. Once the video was shown and the evidence recounted, the judge was more than on board. The fact that the case involved children made it all the more necessary to solve before something fatal occurred. The warrant was signed and backup was called, but on the other side of town, the second officer stumbled onto something troubling. The squad cars were loaded and the liaison from Child Protective Services was called in to supervise the operation. This would hopefully be handled quickly and with care, but none of the officers felt at ease. They all knew something terrible was going on, and it angered them that innocent children were being roped into it. Soon the officers made it to the scene. This time they announced the warrant and demanded to be let in, but still there was no response. The officers knew the house was occupied by the little children, and so to avoid any dangerous turns, the officers barged into the house and announced their presence. The officers were shocked at the scene in front of them. They moved quickly to check the house for any weapons or hostile adults, but these officers were not the only ones witnessing something shocking. The officer who would follow the young girl was surprised to watch her make a mysterious delivery. The house looked worse on the inside than it did outside. It smelled of stale food and dirty children. The flooring was falling apart and the walls were stained. The house was filled with children, some sleeping on the floors with what looks like their prized possessions, and others sat at their tables working to repackage water bottles. The entire ordeal was heartbreaking. The officers later discovered that the owner of the house had lured the homeless children into the house by promising them shelter in exchange for a small stipend in the shelter, while he used the children to produce and transport the products. The other officer who'd followed the little girl had watched her make a similar delivery before she returned to the park. The bottles were all seized and sent to be tested. While the children were removed from the house, the little girl explained that she chose the park because the house was too crowded to sleep in. The police officers were glad to get the children out of the home and quickly opened a case against the owner of the house. He was arrested and awaits trial as he had engaged in child labor exploitation and a host of other illegal activities, but they still worried for the children. The children were all taken by Child Protective Services, and luckily over a series of months, many of the children were returned to their parents or closest living relatives. While others were put into the foster care system, some of which were adopted. But people were most curious about the little girl who'd started it all. Although the custody officials tried to rehouse her, they soon discovered that she was an orphan with no close relatives to be found. The little girl insisted she's allowed to return to the park, but it was illegal as she's a minor. Instead, she was placed into a foster home and allowed to visit the park often, as she felt most at home there.